So it's a fantastic privilege to be here today and actually in this really rather wonderful space, and I loved Adam's idea for what this could become. It's also a real privilege to be able to address you today on this matter, which is fairly obviously close to my heart, but I hope to be able to give more than the rather obvious response of somebody who loves history and heritage, and to talk a bit about the way that I think church buildings can be part of the missional future and growth of the church, as well as something that helps us to engage in exactly the ways that Bishop Trevor was articulating with these hugely significant social issues. I've been director of the Cathedral and Churches team in Church House in London since January 2017, and in 2 years I've been able to visit most dioceses. There's still a few to tick off. And fundamentally I've been working to try and assess and focus on what the National Buildings team should be doing to support dioceses. Of course, we carry out our bit of the faculty process, more on that later, but we do much more than that, I hope. And I hope that what we are trying to do will chime with your own aspirations. What we are mutually concerned with is the growth, both spiritual and numerical, of the Church of England in its work to bring people to Christ. Thomas Hardy in 1906, who was an architect as well as an author, said this: "To the incumbent, the church is a workshop. To the antiquary, it is a relic. To the parish, it's a utility, and to the outsider, a luxury. How to unite these incompatibles?" So 100 years later, we still haven't really got an answer to that very reasonable question. Canterbury Diocese, according to the online faculty system, has 365 churches. Now, every single time I read one of these stats out, somebody comes up to me later and says, "You've got that wrong." Perfectly willing to accept that, but it does include closed churches and non-parochial setups. In 2018, between the entire diocese, there were 259 faculty applications, which includes all the List A and List B matters, so all these changes to churches. And even so poor a mathematician as myself can see that that means the majority of churches, on average in this diocese, are involved in doing things to their buildings. Now, this situation is reflected across a lot of the country, not quite all, but most. Church buildings are places that do not stand still. And today I've looked at some of the wider pressures and contexts, but also some of the things that are out there that I believe can help us to reframe the debate around this millstone or mission, and to come to a more nuanced, more centralised understanding of how the buildings and their physical presence and what that means, particularly to those who are not part of the church, can be part of our future. So I'm going to start with a quote from Neil Gaiman's American Gods. I don't know if anybody knows this book. There's currently a rather poor adaptation of it on Netflix, which I don't recommend. But the book is brilliant. It's a sort of fantasy horror, and it explores the nature of gods in the USA. The character of Odin describes what we find in what he calls churches, temples, and sacred places. People, he says, feel themselves being pulled to places where they can recognize that part of themselves that is truly transcendent. Now, whatever your perspective is in looking after historic religious buildings and church buildings, whether that is from a position of being an incumbent, of a heritage specialist, of somebody who goes to church, we all have to recognise that there is a possibility within them for inspiration, peace, and the sense of something beyond our individual selves. The buildings are places of gathering, and in that they provide a commonality which serves the common good. It's hard to be an individual when you are gathered within a church. You are part of something much, much bigger. The Church Buildings Report, way back in 2015, told us without a doubt that the way we manage our church buildings cannot stay as it's always been. The report said that what is understood by open for worship has evolved over time, depending on local contexts, and will need to evolve further for some buildings over the coming years. More generally, the overall legislative framework governing the use and management of church buildings needs to be simpler, less prescriptive, less bureaucratic for laity and clergy. There needs to be more flexibility to reflect the wide diversity of local situations. Well, amen to that. But as I've travelled around the country in the last 2 years, I've heard that buildings, even those that are really quite beloved of their communities, are a burden to manage, that they cost an awful lot, that the legal systems we have, which were designed originally to help, are actually now a hindrance. And the costs of keeping buildings running can take resources away from evangelism and discipleship and worship. Now, this breaks my heart because the 16,000 churches of England were built specifically for the glory of God, and they are our inheritance. And I sincerely believe that through their presence they are a strong missional tool. A recent line from the Director of Communications at the Archbishop's Council, Tashi Lascelles, highlighted this. I didn't pay her to say this, I swear. She says, "The importance of churches and cathedrals in the life of the country was the most common theme identified in February's media coverage. From the vigil held for missing student Libby Squire, to the front page splash on the Daily Telegraph when Synod voted through changes to the church's obligation to hold Sunday services, all underlined the importance of the physical church to the heart of the nation." This perspective is such an important one. What the church means to us as Christians, as members of an individual church, or as those responsible for helping care for multiple churches, communities and buildings, is only a part of the picture. We have to always bear in mind what it means to those who are looking in but not coming in. So for me, the challenge is to re-inspire those who care for our buildings, trying to take away what burdens we legitimately can, redesign a legal and advice system around modern day needs, focus on issues of funding and training and capacity, bring together resources in new ways, and start to leverage the potential of things like collective buying in areas such as insurance. Oh, and reconvince the government that church buildings are such a key part of England's heritage that they deserve its monetary support. Sounds pretty easy. Robert Louis Stevenson said, "I never weary of great churches. It is my favourite kind of mountain scenery. Mankind was never so happily inspired as when it made a cathedral." And of course, this is a sentiment that's been repeated by many. Increasing atheism does not spell irrelevance for the buildings that we have. In fact, actually quite the opposite. Churches are physical representations of the faith, and implicit in that is hope and inspiration. And as Bishop Trevor has told us, the Christian presence in every community, which is at the heart of what it means to be the Church of England, is based around our parish system and the buildings within it. That doesn't mean we have to keep everything. That doesn't mean we have to look exactly the way everything did in the Middle Ages. But the momentous events of a life can still be measured out in the parish records. And having church buildings that are open is at the heart of this. The Archbishop's Council, just last week, approved a new stream of the National Renewal and Reform Programme entitled Buildings for Mission. Now, as I'm sure you know, renewal and reform is an umbrella term for an ambitious programme of work which is seeking to provide what it calls a narrative of hope for the Church of England in the 21st century. And it builds on three goals we've already heard about: to contribute to continue the national church's contribution to the common good, to facilitate the growth of the church, and to reimagine ministry. And one of the clear and intended outcomes is to reverse the numerical decline of the Church of England to become a growing church, as we've heard about already. Buildings for Mission, sitting within the Renewal and Reform stream, is a brand new thing. You are actually the first people to hear about it. It only happened last week. It will have four main areas of work, which bring together what my team is doing and what in conversations we have identified as the key areas for development. So that's improving the ways we work, the legal systems and the processes around our church buildings. That bit, I will admit, is slightly turgid, but if we don't get it right, nothing else is going to work. Managing the national profile of churches and cathedrals, particularly in relation to external funding arrangements. We know that it's a truth universally acknowledged that a church in possession of a building must be in want of a grant. We'll get on that. The third stream is to support the innovative use of church buildings, exactly the way Adam articulated at the beginning for this school, in fact. How can we encourage visitors to experience Christ in a way that they might not have expected, to have that opportunity for encounter, whilst also maintaining a mixed use that includes the potential for secular uses to be brought in, alongside mission, worship, social justice, and all of the things that we already know about. And then, of course, a fourth thing underpinning all of that is how can we improve capacity? How can we give people more skills? How can we do more training? How can we share best practice both at diocesan and parish level to allow the full potential of buildings to be realised? The drawing together of this renewal and reform stream is a huge opportunity to show a new strategic approach designed to support parishes and dioceses as they seek to grow attendance, as you seek to grow the spiritual life of the church. So my main question is, what can we do, this is us collectively, which will directly improve and release the potential of church buildings for mission, ministry and worship? So imagine, if you will, a semi-rural area. It could be anywhere in England, but let's say it's in Kent. We have a beautiful medieval church in a small village. It has some parking, it doesn't have any toilets, doesn't have any Wi-Fi, it's really dynamite Instagram fodder. Everyone wants to get married there or hold a christening. So pretty. Down the road in the market town is a big Victorian church. It is big enough to have enough space to be adapted, and it now includes all sorts of facilities, including a cafe and a children's play area, and is open every day of the week. The cafe is run by a local company on a lease arrangement. On Sundays, this church holds 3 different services: a BCP in the early morning, a family-friendly service at 11, and an evening service which varies between youth work and Teze-style services. And it also offers 3 midweek services for office workers. In an old warehouse in that same town, a Fresh Expressions group meets. They're growing and have asked the diocese what longer-term options there are for a different kind of building for them. They're interested in becoming a resource church, supporting youth evangelism, which is prioritised in the diocese strategic development funding bid. A new town extension is being built nearby, with 4,500 people due to move in. Thanks to its links with the district council, the diocese is able to secure a new space within that extension to become a multi-function community space with a church included. Dotted around the countryside are a number of small Grade 1 listed churches, much loved but not much used. They group together to form a diocesan trust, all staying open as churches but giving the diocese power to negotiate costs like insurance and quinquennial inspections on a collective basis. Work's put into developing friends groups. These churches are also festival churches, meaning that they've formally varied their patterns of worship and hold, on average, 6 to 10 different services each year. The candlelit carols at St Margot's in the Mud are particularly popular. You see, the point about this is the people of England don't hold parish boundaries in their heads, inexplicably. And in the model I've just outlined, different offerings are made within a single locality. These churches work together as a collective. They have information on each other. They make an effort to connect and engage and to point people in the direction that is right for them. All different types of worshipping community are supported, including those who've been using the building for years and wish to continue to do so in a traditional manner. Church buildings are physically open. They contain information on the Christian faith, which is easy for people to engage with if they wish. In other words, the buildings and the places they sit in are an integral part of the diocesan strategy to promote growth, not a troublesome afterthought. These church buildings are a visible symbol of God's presence in every community, with centralised and diocesan level systems that support and facilitate their continued use. So what would it take to get us to a world that could look a bit like this? Now I have to say, I talked through this in an informal way with a couple of members of the House of Bishops last week, and at the end of them, one of them came up to me and said, "All the time you were talking, I was just thinking about how that wouldn't work." Oh, thanks, Bishop. Great. Of course, he was right. There's a huge amount of problems. There's a huge amount of reasons why it wouldn't work at the moment, why it would be difficult, there's 1,000 things that could go wrong. But the point is, if we want a radically different way of supporting our church buildings to be growing, living communities, we have to consider things like radically different legislative regimes. We have to consider major changes to the national and diocesan staff and governance structures around buildings. There are already a number of different initiatives going on around the country exploring elements of this, and of course many parishes are already delivering incredible innovation and creativity in the way they're using their church buildings, and we're going to hear about some of them later. So within my team, we are encouraging dioceses to integrate thinking about church buildings with their mission and ministry planning. So the possibilities and challenges of the buildings are part of the overall growth strategy, and our main tool for this is diocesan strategic reviews of church buildings. The Church Buildings Review says that regular diocesan strategic reviews which take account of diocesan and deanery plans, mission action plans and parish audits are important for ensuring that buildings issues are given their proper weight, neither dominating nor being overlooked or regarded as a specialist subject. The Diocese of Hereford, for example, has produced an online toolkit called Crossing the Threshold, which at a whopping 268 pages contains all of the advice, hints and tips for any group who wish to take on a community development approach towards adapting a church building for wider community use whilst balancing the needs of existing worshippers. It's very much mutual gain rather than zero sum. You can have both. In the Diocese of Ely, they're in the first year of a 3-year programme called Reach Ely, which slightly bizarrely stands for Reimagining Churches as Community Assets for the Common Good. I think the acronym came first, but it's a very good one, never mind. They're working with the Judge Business School in Cambridge and taking an approach to carry out research on how to help communities, and this is the community of a place, not the worshipping community, make fuller use of their churches. And they aim to provide a clear understanding of the relationship between communities and the wider use of buildings and the contribution churches make to the common good. They're looking at ways in which you can determine community values, needs and opportunities, and that can be used as the most effective way to ensure win-win outcomes for communities and the sustainable future of historic church buildings. In the Diocese of Exeter, they have their Growing the Rural Church initiative, which was funded by Central Strategic Development Funding. And that was the first time that the SDF had really looked at a project that was predicated on buildings. They are working with rural mission communities to develop resources to enable them to grow in prayer, make new disciples and serve the people of Devon. They are particularly looking at supporting rural churches to partner with local communities, as well as external agencies, to find sustainable missional, community, commercial and cultural uses for their church buildings. Now, sustainability is a word that comes up an awful lot, and it's about to come up again in talking about what the UK government is doing. Often, sustainable means financial, but we take a definition that is wider than that and includes social and environmental sustainability. If you focus just on the money and on nothing else, you will lose the other two aspects. So having this balance, and I know the Synod is debating the environmental policy later today, having this balance between those three aspects of sustainability is a really core part of what the Diocese of Exeter is doing. And of course the UK government is also helping us out a little bit. There's a £1.8 million pilot going on at the moment on the recommendations of the Taylor Review of Church Building Sustainability, is that word again. The pilots are trying out a new way of generating long-term sustainability for places of worship by employing specialist officers, in this case a community development advisor and a fabric support officer who work in tandem and have access to a small maintenance and repair grant pot. Being trialled in Manchester and Suffolk, with results expected in March 2020. But I will say that we already know that support officers are one of the biggest contributions a diocese can make to the overall care of its church buildings and their continued use. On average, for every £1 that's spent on a support officer, whether that's through their salary or through expenses, they bring in around £13 in terms of both direct grants and collateral benefits like pro bono contributions for the care of church buildings. Many dioceses have got some form of support officer, and they vary a little bit. Somewhere like the Diocese of Lincoln balances between fabric and community, whereas others combine it into one role. So in conjunction with a strategic approach that boosts mission and cuts fixed costs, I think the Church of England can model a fruitful partnership with our local communities, which says that their church building is open for them. We need to expand the use of buildings to plan more effectively for maintenance and care, and we'll never be able to please everyone or do everything. But issues such as accessibility, making buildings that people can come into, making buildings that people want to come into, balancing heritage with the management of change, supporting rural congregations, supporting communities on urban estates, these are things that we can and are trying to improve on. Now, I do know funding is a major issue. The loss of the Grants for Places of Worship scheme was a really major blow. We are working very, very hard at national level to try and seek a redress on that and a replacement for it. But even if every single church building in the Diocese of Canterbury was in perfect repair, many of the questions that we're talking about today and the conversations that I've been talking about having would still be relevant. How can churches be adapted? What do modern worshipping communities want? What do modern non-worshipping communities want? How do we balance short-term needs with the centuries-long history of the church as a physical presence in a place? There is no easy or one-size-fits-all answer to the question of what we can do that will directly improve and release the potential of church buildings for mission, ministry and worship. There are, of course, efforts we can make, which includes having a really brilliant DAC, whose perspective starts from a desire to help the people who are supporting the running of a church, rather than seeing themselves as a heritage-based regulator. At national level, we will be aligning our work around the 4 areas of the new Renewal and Reform programme. So that's looking at the law, looking at funding, looking at ways to support extended use, and building capacity. And I want to hear ideas, whether it's directly today, by email afterwards, or as part of a consultation and conversation that we're going to be having later this year, of what we can do to support you better. So church buildings, mission or millstone. Buildings will become millstones if they're only ever considered as an afterthought. Ignoring the reality of the physical infrastructure when putting together things like ministry deployment plans creates problems that could otherwise be mitigated. Now, I know that diocesan staff, diocesan clergy are enormously busy. It can be tempting to direct every letter that has building in it immediately to the DAC secretary. But if this happens, then far too often the only time buildings will come up naturally for most of you is through complaints and problems. Metal theft, difficult legal processes, expensive repair needs, wrangles over gravestones. It doesn't have to be like this. And that's why it's so encouraging to have this focus here today. In a way, I would almost stand up and say, I don't really care what you think about church buildings, theologically or otherwise, because you've got them. We've got to do something to make sure that they are well integrated. Now I'm going to finish by talking about Philip Larkin. Now, church going is always worth revisiting. It was written in 1955, and it ponders what will happen when churches fall completely out of use, a few cathedrals chronically on show. Larkin really approaches a lot of life in wanting to be a cynic, and he often finds himself tripped up, I think, by his own discoveries. And in church-going, you see how he is concluding that even though he doesn't really want there to be, the pattern of England is built with churches woven into it. To lose church buildings, whether it's through a lack of money, a lack of care, or deliberate policies to rid ourselves of something which seems burdensome, expensive and troublesome, is to reduce the physical visibility of Christ in this land. It's worth knowing that the Church of England is the only church body in Western Europe that does not have large-scale plans to close the majority of its buildings. We're the only ones. Norway, they want to close about half. Germany, about a third. Sweden, they're already in the process of trying to scale back. Even the Vatican held a conference called God Doesn't Live Here Anymore. It's the first time they've dealt with this issue. Yeah. We really have a plan to try and support this. It doesn't mean keeping absolutely everything. But the parish system, the physical presence is important. And so I will finish by quoting Larkin, because nothing I could say would be nearly as good. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognised and robed as destinies. And that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. Thank you.